had 15 hours to live. Here is how Cadia spent them. The last world before the Eye of Terror does not grant merciful deaths. For 10,000 years, it has refined the art of dying slowly, methodically, with proper imperial documentation. When the 13th Black Crusade finally cracked the planet's spine, it left behind a masterclass in institutional brutality that continued to function even as reality itself began to fray. The wounded, the lost, and the forgotten still had quotas to meet. This is the story of mankind's most efficient killing ground, where hope was rationed and despair came standard issue. It begins with a requisition form and ends with a body count that required its own department. The planet that broke before the Guard did had one last lesson to teach about service, sacrifice, and the specific weight of a laser gun when you no longer have the strength to lift it. To understand why Cadia looked like a graveyard wearing parade dress, you start at the beginning. The world was never meant for humans. Its proximity to the Eye of Terror should have rendered it uninhabitable. A screaming void where physics went to die and sanity followed shortly after. Instead, the Imperium did what it always does with impossible situations. It built a bureaucracy around them. The first settlements were not cities, but filing cabinets with walls, administrative complexes designed to process the endless stream of reinforcements that would be needed to hold the gate. The Imperial fists arrived in 781.M31, during the immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when the Eye of Terror was still vomiting forth the remnants of the War Master's shattered legions. They found a world of purple grass and silver mountains, where the Aurora Borealis danced with colors that had no names and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. The first fortress was built on the site where Kasar, Dearth, would eventually stand, a simple bunker complex designed to house a single company of space marines and monitor warp activity around the Cadian Gate. Within a century, the bunker had grown into a city. Within a millennium, the city had spawned 17 sister settlements, each one connected to the others by underground rail networks that could transport entire regiments from one end of the continent to the other in less than 6 hours. The Cadian Gate was not a metaphor. It was a choke point in the warp, a narrow passage that forced chaos fleets into predictable attack patterns. Every military academy in the Imperium taught the same lesson. Control Cadia, control the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror. What they did not teach was the cost of that control, measured not in lives lost, but in lives spent with the precision of an accountant calculating depreciation on heavy equipment. The planet's infrastructure reflected its grim purpose. Every building was a fortress, every street a killing field, every park a designated artillery impact zone. Civilian architecture did not exist on Cadia because civilians did not exist on Cadia. Children learned to strip and clean laser guns before they learned to read. Elderly citizens served as human mind detectors until they could no longer walk, at which point they were processed into nutrition supplements for the younger generations. The first death came during the Gothic War, when Abaddon's fleets shattered 3 naval battle groups in the space above its cities. The orbital bombardment lasted for 72 hours and reduced the planetary capital to a crater lake that glowed green in the dark. Cadia rebuilt, using the fused glass of the crater as a foundation for a new fortress complex that was larger and more heavily defended than its predecessor. The second death came when the Fourth Black Crusade breached the Kasir River line and held it for 18 months. Chaos forces occupied half the planet and began constructing ritual sites designed to expand the Eye of Terror's influence beyond the Cadian Gate. Imperial forces retook the occupied territory building by building, room by room, with flame units and demolition charges. The purification process took 3 years and left vast swaths of the planet uninhabitable due to chemical contamination and lingering warp corruption. The third death came during the Seventh Black Crusade, when Demon Primarch Mortarion led the Death Guard in a campaign that lasted 6 years and transformed entire continents into diseased wasteland. The Plague Wars introduced new forms of institutional brutality as Imperial forces learned to operate in environments where the air itself was toxic and the ground crawled with diseases that had never existed in real space. Quarantine protocols were developed that required entire regiments to be sterilized with flame weapons if they showed signs of chaos corruption. By the time the 13th Black Crusade arrived, dying and rebuilding had become the planet's primary industry, its only export the knowledge of how to make suffering efficient. Cadia had developed institutional expertise in defeat, bureaucratic procedures that could transform military disasters into strategic advantages through the careful application of administrative process and documented lessons learned. Names matter here, because each name decides a fate. The Guard divided its personnel into categories with the detached precision of an abattoir sorting cuts of meat. The classification system had been refined through 10 millennia of constant warfare, each revision written in blood and filed in archives that required their own cities to house properly. Frontline troopers carried the designation Expendable Primary, a classification that guaranteed medical attention for wounds that would not permanently reduce combat effectiveness. Primary expendables received combat drugs, enhanced rations, and equipment maintenance priority. They were expected to survive for an average of 6 weeks in active combat zones before requiring replacement due to death, disabling injury, or psychological breakdown. Expendable secondary ratings received bandages and stim packs, but not surgical intervention for wounds exceeding a specific severity threshold. Secondary expendables served as ammunition bearers, equipment carriers, and human shields during urban combat operations. Their expected survival time was calculated at 18 days, though this figure included non-combat casualties such as workplace accidents, equipment failures, and summary executions for disciplinary infractions. Expendable tertiary received last rites and nothing else. Tertiary classification was typically assigned to penal legion conscripts, civilian populations in contested areas, and military personnel who had been exposed to chaos corruption but not yet undergone complete psychological transformation. Tertiary expendables were used for mine clearing, reconnaissance in force, and suicide assault missions against hardened enemy positions. Command staff operated under different rules entirely. General Primaris rankings carried personal shields, augmetic enhancements, and dedicated Medici teams trained in advanced surgical procedures. Their expected survival time was measured in years rather than weeks, and their death required formal investigation by commissariat officials to determine whether replacement was necessary or whether subordinate officers could assume command responsibilities. Colonel militant positions included evacuation protocols, off-world transport authorization, and access to strategic weapon systems that could level city blocks. Colonel militants received training in void warfare, orbital bombardment coordination, and political negotiation with other imperial institutions. Their loss was considered a strategic asset degradation that required immediate replacement through transfer from other theater commands. Major tactical grades received combat drugs that would keep them functional for 72 hours past the point where normal humans would have succumbed to blood loss, trauma, or psychological breakdown. Major tacticals were expected to maintain unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness, even when 90% of their command had been eliminated. They received training in battlefield psychology, logistics management, and casualty processing procedures. Captain frontline positions required specialization in specific combat environments: urban warfare, tunnel fighting, chemical contamination zones, or areas with significant warp corruption. Captain frontlines received equipment packages tailored to their operational environment and training in enemy identification, threat assessment, and resource allocation under extreme stress conditions. Lieutenant field grades served as expendable command assets, officers who could be deployed to units that had lost their leadership to enemy action or disciplinary execution. Lieutenant fields received accelerated training in multiple military specializations and were expected to integrate into existing command structures with minimal orientation period. Their survival statistics were classified information, but informal estimates suggested they lived longer than frontline troops, but not as long as sergeants. Support personnel existed in their own administrative purgatory, caught between the front lines and the rear echelons with responsibilities to both and protection from neither. Munitorium clerks held civilian essential status, which protected them from frontline deployment but not from the collateral damage of orbital bombardment, terrorist attacks, or administrative executions for record-keeping errors. Commissars answered only to the Emperor and carried summary execution authority for anyone below the rank of colonel. They received training in psychology, politics, military law, and marksmanship. Commissar doctrine emphasized the importance of maintaining discipline through visible demonstrations of imperial authority, which typically meant shooting anyone who displayed signs of cowardice, incompetence, or insufficient enthusiasm for dying in the Emperor's service. Médecins orderlies fell under medical auxiliary classification, a designation that required them to treat any wounded imperial personnel regardless of rank, species, or the likelihood that the patient would survive the procedure. Medical auxiliaries received training in battlefield surgery, pharmaceutical administration, and psychological counseling for personnel suffering from combat stress disorders. They were forbidden from refusing treatment to any imperial citizen and could be executed for medical malpractice if their patients died from preventable causes. Tech adepts served under the authority of the Omnicia and maintained the machine spirits that kept Cadia's defensive systems operational. They received augmetic enhancements that allowed them to interface directly with weapon systems, communication networks, and transportation infrastructure. Tech adepts could not be executed by commissariat personnel without formal approval from the Adeptus Mechanicus, but they could be declared heretical and subjected to summary lobotomization if their augmetics showed signs of chaos corruption. The Vox operators occupied their own special category of hell. Designated as communications vital, they could not be executed for cowardice as long as they remained at their posts. But neither could they be relieved from duty without formal authorization from regimental command. During the worst battles, Vox operators would stay connected to command networks for days past the point where everyone else in their unit was dead, calling in coordinates for artillery strikes on their own positions, while Chaos cultists searched the ruins for survivors. Logistics specialists maintained the supply chains that kept Cadia's military machine operational despite constant enemy interdiction. They received training in inventory management, transportation security, and resource allocation under combat conditions. Logistics specialists could requisition equipment, ammunition, and personnel from any imperial institution operating on Cadia, but they were personally responsible for any resources that could not be accounted for according to regulation procedures. Intelligence operatives gathered information about enemy capabilities, intentions, and movements through surveillance, infiltration, and interrogation of captured personnel. They received training in languages, cultural analysis, and enhanced interrogation techniques. Intelligence operatives could authorize surveillance operations against any imperial personnel suspected of disloyalty, but they could be executed without trial if their reports contained information that contradicted official doctrine or policy. On the ground, it reduces to a timetable and a heartbeat. The standard Cadian duty rotation begins at 0400 with weapons inspection, continues through 18 hours of combat operations, and concludes with a 6-hour sleep cycle that no one expects you to survive long enough to complete. The planet operates on a 48-hour day, which meant that guardsmen experienced sunset twice for every period of rest they were theoretically allocated. Morning begins with the distribution of standard rations, 1 nutrition cube, 1 water reclamation tablet, and 1 stim dose calculated to maintain combat effectiveness for the next 24 hours. The nutrition cube contains all necessary vitamins and minerals required to sustain human life at the minimum functional level. It tastes like cardboard soaked in engine oil and has the texture of wet concrete mixed with sawdust and disappointment. Veterans learn to dissolve it in their water ration to make it edible. New recruits try to eat it dry and spend their first week vomiting blood while their digestive systems adapt to the synthetic nutrients. The water reclamation tablet is designed to purify any liquid source into potable water, including standing water contaminated with industrial chemicals, biological waste, or low-level radioactive materials. Each tablet can process up to 2 liters of fluid and remains effective for 48 hours after activation. The purified water has a metallic taste and a slightly oily texture, but it will not cause immediate death from poisoning. Long-term consumption leads to kidney damage and liver dysfunction, but these conditions typically develop over a period of years, and most guardsmen do not live long enough for chronic health problems to become militarily significant. The stim dose contains a carefully balanced mixture of combat drugs designed to enhance reflexes, suppress pain, and maintain alertness during extended combat operations. The pharmaceutical cocktail includes synthetic adrenaline analogs, neurotransmitter inhibitors, and hormonal regulators that allow human beings to function at peak efficiency for periods far exceeding normal biological limitations. Side effects include cardiac arrhythmia, psychological dependency, and permanent damage to the central nervous system. Withdrawal symptoms begin within 6 hours of the last dose and include seizures, hallucinations, and complete cardiovascular collapse. Equipment check follows breakfast. Every guardsman receives 1 laser gun, 6 charge packs, 1 flak vest, 1 helmet, 1 entrenching tool, 1 field dressing, and 1 set of identification tags. The equipment distribution process is supervised by quartermaster personnel who maintain detailed records of every item issued, including serial numbers, manufacturing dates, and maintenance histories. The laser gun is considered reliable because it will fire until the power cell is exhausted, at which point it becomes a club capable of crushing human skulls with sufficient force. Laser gun maintenance requires daily cleaning, weekly calibration, and monthly replacement of internal components that wear out under battlefield conditions. Each laser gun has an expected service life of 6 months under normal use, though most weapons are recovered from their previous users before reaching their replacement threshold. The charge packs contain enough energy to fire approximately 100 shots at standard power settings, though this figure decreases significantly if the weapon is used on higher power settings designed to penetrate heavy armor. Charge packs can be recharged using standard power sources, but the recharging process takes 8 hours and requires specialized equipment that is typically not available in forward combat areas. Most guardsmen carry dead charge packs for weeks, hoping to find a functioning power source before their ammunition runs out completely. The flak vest will stop small arms fire and shrapnel from a distance of more than 50 meters, though its protective value decreases rapidly as the range closes. Flak vests are manufactured in standard sizes and do not account for individual body variations, which means they fit properly on approximately 30% of the personnel who wear them. Poorly fitting armor creates gaps in protection that experienced enemies learn to exploit during close combat engagements. The helmet is designed to protect against falling debris and to contain the contents of a guardsman's skull when he is shot in the head, which simplifies cleanup procedures and allows medical personnel to recover identification tags and personal effects more efficiently. Helmets include basic communication equipment that allows squad-level coordination during combat operations, though the communication systems frequently malfunction due to electromagnetic interference from energy weapons and psychic phenomena. The entrenching tool serves multiple functions that are not described in its technical manual. It can dig foxholes, remove debris, break through barricades, and kill enemies in close combat with proper technique. Most importantly, it can dig graves, which on Cadia was considered essential equipment for any military unit operating away from established base areas. Entrenching tools require regular maintenance and sharpening, but they are virtually indestructible under normal battlefield conditions. The field dressing will stop bleeding from any wound smaller than a last burn, provided the wound does not involve major arterial damage or internal organ perforation. For larger injuries, the standard procedure is to apply the field dressing anyway and hope that death comes quickly enough to prevent unnecessary suffering. Field dressings include basic antiseptic chemicals that reduce the risk of infection, though they are not effective against biological or chemical weapons. The identification tags contain each guardsman's name, serial number, unit designation, blood type, religious affiliation, and next of kin information. The tags are manufactured from materials that will survive most forms of battlefield damage, including energy weapons, explosive devices, and chemical corrosives. Tag recovery is a priority during casualty processing because the information they contain is required for completion of death certificates and casualty reports. Combat operations begin at 0600 and continue until the threat is neutralized, the position is overrun, or the unit takes casualties exceeding 75% of effective strength. whichever comes first. The definition of threat neutralized varies depending on the tactical situation, but generally requires either complete destruction of enemy forces or successful completion of assigned mission objectives as defined by regimental command. Position overrun is defined as enemy occupation of designated defensive areas despite continued resistance from defending forces. Overrun positions are typically subjected to artillery bombardment or orbital strikes to deny their use to enemy forces, regardless of whether Imperial personnel are still alive in the target area. The decision to authorize fire missions against overrun positions is made by officers at the regimental level or higher, based on tactical assessments and strategic priorities. Casualty thresholds are calculated based on unit strength at the beginning of each combat operation. A unit that begins an engagement with 100 effective personnel reaches its casualty threshold when 75 of those personnel have been killed, wounded, or otherwise rendered unable to continue fighting. Units that exceed their casualty threshold are considered combat ineffective and are withdrawn from active operations for reconstitution or dissolution. The Cadian shock troops were famous throughout the galaxy for their discipline under fire, their ability to hold defensive positions against impossible odds, and their tendency to keep fighting for several minutes after sustaining wounds that should have been immediately fatal. This reputation was not the result of superior training or exceptional courage, though both factors contributed to their combat effectiveness. The primary factor in Cadian combat performance was the systematic conditioning program that began in early childhood and continued throughout military service. Cadian children were exposed to combat stress from age 5 through participation in war games that used live ammunition and realistic casualty effects. By the time they reached military age, most Cadians had already experienced battlefield conditions and developed psychological resistance to combat trauma. This reputation was also the product of combat drugs administered in the morning stim dose, pharmaceutical cocktails that suppressed pain, enhanced reflexes, and prevented the human nervous system from shutting down in response to catastrophic trauma. The drugs were developed specifically for Cadian forces based on decades of medical research and battlefield testing under controlled conditions. The side effects included permanent damage to the cardiovascular system, addiction requiring progressively larger doses to maintain effectiveness, and psychological changes that made it difficult for veterans to function in civilian environments. Long-term use also caused liver damage, kidney failure, and neurological disorders that typically manifested 5 to 10 years after initial exposure. Not that civilian environments were a consideration on Cadia. The planet had not possessed a non-combatant population since the Ninth Black Crusade, when the Departamento Munitorum determined that feeding non-essential personnel represented an inefficient allocation of resources that could be better used to maintain military readiness levels. Children were inducted into the White Shield Auxiliary units at age 10 and graduated to full guard service at 16, assuming they survived the training regimen that had a documented fatality rate of 12%. The training program included weapons familiarization, tactical doctrine, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation for extended combat operations under adverse conditions. White Shield training began with basic military skills, marching, following orders, maintaining equipment, and recognizing different types of enemy forces. Advanced training included specialized skills such as demolitions, communications, medical aid, and urban warfare tactics. The most promising candidates received additional training in leadership, logistics, and intelligence analysis. The elderly were processed into corpse starch rations when they could no longer maintain equipment or serve as human shields during urban combat operations. The processing facilities were operated by Medicae personnel who had received specialized training in efficient disposal of human remains and preparation of nutritional supplements according to Departamento Munitorum specifications. Corpse starch processing was considered a medical procedure rather than an execution, which meant it required proper documentation and authorization from Medicae officers rather than commissariat personnel. The process was designed to be quick and painless, though most elderly citizens preferred to volunteer for suicide missions rather than submit to processing. The suicide missions typically involved reconnaissance in heavily contaminated areas, manual mine clearance in active combat zones, or serving as bait for enemy forces during tactical deception operations. These missions had casualty rates approaching 100%, but they allowed elderly citizens to die in combat rather than in medical facilities. Then there is the moment everyone remembers and no one explains. I am crouched in the ruins of what used to be the shrine of Saint Jasmain, watching my breath steam in the air because the heating units stopped working 3 days ago and no one has time to fix them. The shrine was built during the Fifth Black Crusade to commemorate a saint who died holding a strategic bridge against Chaos forces for 18 hours while reinforcements were brought up from reserve positions. My laser gun feels heavier than it should, and I keep having to remind myself to hold it steady because the stims they gave us this morning are wearing off and my hands want to shake. The weapon is a Mark 7 pattern manufactured on Lucius approximately 15 years ago, based on the serial numbers etched into the receiver. It has been used by at least 6 previous owners, judging from the wear patterns on the grip and trigger assembly. Through the broken stained glass window, I can see the enemy advancing across what used to be Liberation Square. The square was named after the 9th Black Crusade, when Imperial forces recaptured this district after 3 years of Chaos occupation. The fountain in the center of the square depicts an Imperial guardsman standing over a defeated Chaos warrior, though both statues have been damaged by artillery fire and no longer clearly represent either figure. They move like shadows given flesh, their armor black as the void between stars, their weapons wreathed in flames that burn without heat. Chaos Space Marines, traitor Astartes, the angels that fell so far from grace that they took gravity with them. Their power armor bears the heraldry of the Black Legion, the sons of Horus who followed their war master into damnation and have spent 10,000 years trying to drag the rest of humanity with them. Each warrior stands nearly 3 meters tall and masses approximately as much as a civilian cargo hauler. Their armor is powered by fusion reactors that will continue operating for centuries without maintenance. And their weapons are artifacts from the dark age of technology that predate the Imperium itself. They move with mechanical precision, following tactical doctrines developed during the Great Crusade and refined through 10 millennia of constant warfare. My Voxcaster crackles to life with the harsh static that indicates transmission through heavy electromagnetic interference. Grid 77 Alpha, this is command. Report status. The voice belongs to Lieutenant Vandris, a replacement officer who arrived yesterday to assume command of what was left of our platoon after the previous lieutenant was killed by sniper fire. I press the transmit button and try to keep my voice steady, following communication protocols that require clear, concise reports using standardized terminology. 77 Alpha reporting. Eyes on enemy advance, estimate 2 squadrons, moving northwest toward the Cathedral District. I pause, watching one of the traitors casually rip the turret off a disabled Lemon Russ with his bare hands, the metal screaming as it tears apart. Request immediate artillery support. The tank had been knocked out during yesterday's fighting when a last cannon blast penetrated its front armor and detonated the main ammunition storage compartment. The crew had attempted to abandon the vehicle but were caught by secondary explosions from the fuel tanks. Their bodies are still inside, visible through the commander's hatch, though I try not to look at them directly. Negative 77 Alpha. Artillery support is not available. Your orders are to hold position and observe. The lieutenant's voice carries the flat tone of someone reading from a manual, which he probably is. Replacement officers rarely survive long enough to learn their jobs properly, so they tend to rely on written procedures rather than experience or initiative. Hold position. With a laser gun that might penetrate their armor if I was lucky enough to hit the same spot 50 times in a row. Assuming the power cell lasted that long, and assuming the Chaos Marines were polite enough to stand still while I shot at them. Observe. As if anyone was going to survive long enough to file a report about what I was seeing. The tactical situation is straightforward enough for a replacement officer to understand. 8 guardsmen armed with laser guns and improvised explosive devices are expected to conduct reconnaissance against 12 Chaos Space Marines equipped with bolt weapons, power armor, and 10,000 years of combat experience. The expected outcome is the complete elimination of Imperial forces with minimal casualties inflicted on enemy personnel. But the mission is not about tactical success. It is about gathering intelligence for future operations, data that will be used to plan tomorrow's battles and next week's offensives. Every dead guardsman generates information about enemy capabilities, tactics, and equipment that can be analyzed by intelligence specialists and incorporated into updated tactical doctrine. The first Trader Marine reaches the shrine's outer wall and pauses, tilting his head as if listening to something I cannot hear. His helmet sensors are probably scanning for heat signatures, electromagnetic emissions, and movement patterns that would reveal the location of hidden personnel. The sensors are integrated into his power armor's machine spirit and can detect targets through most forms of concealment. His helmet turns toward my position with mechanical precision, and I realize that he knows exactly where I am hiding, has probably known since I took cover here 20 minutes ago, has been playing with me the way a cat plays with a mouse before crushing its spine. The targeting system in his helmet is already calculating firing solutions and estimating the probability of successful target elimination. He raises his bolt pistol, and I have just enough time to remember what my drill instructor told us during training. When facing Astartes in combat, your primary objective is to die in a manner that provides useful intelligence to your superiors. The bolt round punches through the wall inches from my head, spraying my face with fragments of blessed stone and leaving a hole large enough to put my fist through. The explosive round detonates on contact with the interior wall, filling the air with stone dust and smoke that smells like burned incense and human fear. The shrine has been consecrated ground for over 2,000 years, blessed by countless prayers and sanctified by the blood of martyrs. The Chaos Marines are defiling it with their mere presence, corrupting the sacred space with their unholy aura. I return fire because that is what guardsmen do. The last beam strikes his chest plate and disappears into the ceramite without leaving so much as a scorch mark, the energy absorbed by defensive fields that shimmer briefly around his massive frame. He laughs, a sound like grinding metal filtered through vox grills designed to intimidate rather than communicate, and begins walking toward the shrine with the unhurried confidence of something that has all the time in the universe and knows exactly how it wants to spend it. My Voxcaster crackles again with transmission static that sounds like screaming. 7-7 Alpha, command is showing discharge signatures from your position. Are you engaging the enemy? Lieutenant Vandrus sounds slightly surprised, as if he expected me to die quietly without making noise that might attract attention. Affirmative, command. Engaging enemy advance. I switch my laser gun to maximum power and fire again, knowing that it will drain the charge pack faster, but hoping that the increased energy output might at least leave a mark on the Chaos Marine's armor. The beam strikes his shoulder pauldron and produces a brief flash of light, but no visible damage. Understood. Continue engagement until ammunition is expended, then assume fallback position Delta and await further orders. The lieutenant's voice carries the bureaucratic certainty of someone who has read the tactical manual but has never actually seen a Chaos Space Marine in person. Fallback position Delta is a crater that used to be a medical station before yesterday's orbital bombardment. The coordinates are marked on my tactical map as a rally point for surviving personnel, but the location is currently occupied by unexploded ordnance and the remains of a field hospital that was caught in the blast radius. There are no further orders coming because command knows I will be dead before I can reach the crater. This is not a battle plan. This is a death schedule, administered with the same bureaucratic efficiency that governs every other aspect of Imperial military operations. My death has been calculated, evaluated, and approved by officers who will never see my body and will never know my name. I am a data point in a statistical analysis, a number in a casualty projection, a line item in a resource allocation spreadsheet. The Trader Marine reaches the shrine's entrance and stops again, studying the carved reliefs that decorate the doorway with the careful attention of someone who recognizes the craftsmanship. Angels and eagles, bolters and skulls, all the iconography of the Imperium rendered in stone that has survived 10,000 years of war and will outlast whatever happens in the next 10 minutes. The carvings tell the story of St. Jos Main's martyrdom, depicting her final stand against the chaos forces that overwhelmed her position. She held the bridge for 18 hours, fighting with nothing but a broken sword and unshakable faith, buying time for civilian evacuees to reach safety. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found her body surrounded by 37 dead chaos cultists and a pile of expended ammunition that reached her waist. He traces one of the carvings with a gauntleted finger, almost gently, and for a moment I allow myself to imagine that he might spare the shrine, might find some vestige of whatever he used to be before the fall. Perhaps he remembers when he served the Emperor, when he fought for humanity instead of against it, when he believed in something other than the endless cycle of violence and corruption. Then he draws his chainsword and reduces the doorway to rubble in 3 economical cuts. The weapon's teeth tear through the consecrated stone like paper, destroying artwork that took master craftsmen decades to complete. The machine spirit in the chainsword howls with mechanical hunger as it devours the sacred carvings, consuming beauty and hope with equal appetite. I have 4 charge packs left and perhaps 2 minutes before he reaches my position. The Voxcaster is still squawking with reports from other grid positions, other guardsmen dying in other ruins, while command updates its casualty projections and adjusts tomorrow's reinforcement requisitions accordingly. I listen to their voices growing fainter and more desperate as the enemy advance continues, each transmission a small prayer to a god who is too busy counting corpses to answer. Grid 55 Bravo reports contact with enemy armor in the industrial district. Grid 33 Charlie requests immediate medical evacuation for personnel with severe burns from chemical weapons. Grid 99 Delta has gone silent, which probably means that everyone is dead, and the enemy is using their equipment to monitor Imperial communications. The traitor Marine's footsteps echo through the shrine's nave, heavy and rhythmic like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. Each step crushes fragments of stained glass that once depicted scenes from Imperial history, the Emperor's conquest of Terra, the Great Crusade's expansion across the galaxy, the triumph of human civilization over the darkness between the stars. I close my eyes and try to remember what my home looked like before the war came, but all I can picture is smoke and rubble and the taste of recycled air. Cadia has been dying for so long that death has become its natural state, and we are all just visitors in its graveyard. The planet was born in war and raised in violence, and now it is teaching its children how to die properly. The chainsword's roar grows louder as the Chaos Marine approaches my hiding place behind the altar. I can smell the weapon's exhaust fumes and hear the wet sound of its teeth grinding against stone and metal. In a few seconds, he will round the corner and find me crouched here with my empty laser gun and my regulation issue fear. I key the Voxcaster one last time. 7-7 Alpha to command. Grid compromised. Enemy has breached the shrine, transmitting final report. I pause, trying to think of something meaningful to say, some last words that might justify the cost of my training and equipment. The Emperor protects, but the Emperor does not protect. The Emperor consumes. The Emperor demands. The Emperor takes what he needs and discards the rest. After the smoke clears, the rules return. Cadia operated according to regulations that had been refined through 10 millennia of constant warfare. Institutional procedures designed to transform human beings into military assets with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. The planet's administrative apparatus continued to function even during active combat operations, processing casualty reports and replacement requisitions with the mechanical precision of a laser gun cycling through charge packs. The bureaucracy of death was more sophisticated than the machinery of war. While combat operations followed relatively simple tactical doctrines that could be summarized in field manuals, death processing required specialized knowledge, institutional expertise, and bureaucratic procedures that filled entire libraries. Death was Cadia's primary product, manufactured according to quality control standards that would have impressed the Adeptus Mechanicus. Command structure followed strict hierarchical protocols that had been developed during the Gothic War and refined through subsequent conflicts. Squad leaders reported to platoon commanders, who reported to company captains, who reported to regimental colonels, who reported to general staff, who reported to planetary command, who reported to sector command, who reported to the Departamento Munitorum, who reported to the High Lords of Terra. Each level of the hierarchy added its own requirements, its own forms to fill out, its own bureaucratic delays that ensured crucial information took exactly long enough to process that it was no longer relevant by the time it reached the people who could act on it. The delay was not accidental. It was designed to prevent tactical information from reaching strategic decision-makers who might use it to question the wisdom of current operations. Casualty processing required specific documentation that varied depending on the circumstances of death, the rank of the deceased, and the tactical situation in which the death occurred. Every dead guardsman generated 17 separate forms: confirmation of death, cause of death, time of death, location of death, witness statements, equipment recovery reports, next of kin notification, burial detail assignment, replacement requisition, medical examination reports, psychological evaluation of surviving unit members, after-action reviews, lessons learned documentation, training modification recommendations, supply chain impact assessments, and statistical analysis for inclusion in weekly casualty summaries. The forms were filled out in triplicate using regulation ink on regulation paper and filed in regulation folders according to regulation procedures that had not changed since the Great Crusade. Dead guardsmen received serial numbers that were cross-referenced against unit rosters, pay records, medical files, disciplinary reports, training scores, and equipment assignments. The cross-referencing process was performed by specialized clerical personnel who had received training in data management, filing procedures, and psychological resistance to the emotional impact of processing thousands of death certificates. The bureaucracy of death was more complex than the process of living, which explained why Cadia had more clerks than combat troops by the final year of the siege. The clerical staff worked in underground bunkers that were more heavily fortified than most military command posts, because the loss of casualty processing capability would have crippled the planet's ability to function as a military organization. Each death certificate required verification by at least 3 separate officials: the reporting officer who witnessed the death, the medical officer who confirmed that life functions had ceased, and the commissariat representative who verified that the death occurred under circumstances consistent with imperial military doctrine. Discrepancies between the 3 reports triggered investigation procedures that could take weeks to resolve. Medical facilities operated under their own special regulations that had been developed through 10,000 years of battlefield medicine. Triage procedures classified wounded personnel into 5 categories: walking wounded who could return to duty within 24 hours, serious cases requiring surgical intervention, critical cases requiring intensive care, terminal cases requiring only palliative care, and dead cases requiring only disposal. The categories were color-coded for efficiency: green for walking wounded, yellow for serious, red for critical, black for terminal, and gray for dead. The colors were painted on each patient's forehead using waterproof markers designed to remain visible under battlefield conditions, including chemical contamination, extreme temperatures, and electromagnetic interference from energy weapons. Green patients received basic medical attention consisting of field dressings, stim injections, and anti-shock medication. They were expected to return to active duty within 1 standard Terran day, and were assigned to rear area duties if their injuries prevented them from participating in frontline combat operations. Green patients who failed to recover within the specified time frame were reclassified as yellow. Yellow patients underwent surgery if operating rooms were available, and surgical supplies were in stock. The surgery was performed by Medicaid personnel who had received basic training in battlefield medicine, but not necessarily in advanced surgical procedures. Yellow patients who survived surgery were either reclassified as green or upgraded to red depending on their post-operative condition. Yellow patients who died during surgery were reclassified as gray. Red patients received priority treatment if they outranked other patients in the same category, or if their survival was considered strategically important for ongoing military operations. Red classification was typically reserved for command personnel, technical specialists, and guardsmen with information about enemy capabilities or intentions. Red patients who recovered were reclassified as yellow or green. Red patients whose condition deteriorated were downgraded to black. Black patients received pain medication until supplies ran out, then received nothing. Black classification was considered terminal, which meant that medical resources were not wasted on patients who were expected to die regardless of treatment. Black patients were isolated from other patients to prevent them from affecting morale, and their deaths were processed according to expedited procedures that did not require the same level of documentation as other categories. Gray patients were processed through the corpse disposal system, which operated according to procedures designed to prevent the spread of disease, conserve resources that could be used for military purposes, and maintain unit morale by removing visible reminders of mortality. Gray processing included identification recovery, equipment salvage, medical examination to determine cause of death, and disposal of remains according to methods appropriate for the tactical situation. Equipment recovery followed similar protocols that had been refined through millennia of logistical experience. Damaged weapons were classified as repairable, salvageable for parts, or suitable only for scrap metal. The classification was performed by armorer personnel who had received training in weapon maintenance, damage assessment, and resource allocation under battlefield conditions. Repairable weapons were sent to armory workshops for maintenance by qualified technicians who had access to replacement parts, specialized tools, and technical manuals. The repair process typically took between 2 and 5 days, depending on the extent of damage and the availability of components. Repaired weapons were tested for functionality and accuracy before being redistributed to combat units. Salvageable weapons were disassembled and their components distributed to units with repairable weapons requiring replacement parts. The salvage process was supervised by technical personnel who maintained detailed records of part compatibility, serial numbers, and distribution chains. Salvage operations were considered critical for maintaining overall weapon readiness levels when new equipment was not available through normal supply channels. Scrap weapons were melted down and reformed into ammunition, medical equipment, or construction materials for defensive fortifications. The recycling process was performed in industrial facilities that operated continuously despite enemy bombardment and supply shortages. Scrap metal was considered a strategic resource that required the same level of security and accounting as live ammunition. Personal effects of deceased personnel were inventoried and either returned to surviving family members or redistributed to replacement personnel, depending on the item's military utility and the administrative complexity of locating next of kin. The inventory process was performed by quartermaster personnel who had received training in property law, resource allocation, and grief counseling. Letters from home were typically burned to prevent information security breaches that could compromise ongoing military operations. The letters often contained information about industrial production, troop movements, and civilian morale that could be useful to enemy intelligence services. Burning was considered more secure than censoring because it eliminated the possibility of coded messages or invisible ink. Photographs were recycled into paper for administrative forms through chemical processing that dissolved the image substrate and extracted cellulose fibers suitable for papermaking. The recycling process was considered both practical and psychologically beneficial because it eliminated emotional attachments that might interfere with military efficiency. Personal weapons, if they survived the engagement that killed their owners, were cleaned and redistributed to incoming replacements, along with the serial numbers and maintenance records of their previous users. Personal weapons were typically better maintained than standard issue equipment because their owners had emotional investment in their functionality and appearance. Religious items were either destroyed or redistributed, depending on their compliance with imperial doctrine and their potential effect on unit morale. Approved religious items included imperial saints' medallions, prayer books, and devotional texts that reinforced loyalty to the emperor. Disapproved items included family heirlooms, cultural artifacts, and anything that might encourage regional identity rather than imperial citizenship. The system worked because it was designed to work regardless of casualties, regardless of losses. regardless of the complete destruction of individual units or entire regiments. Kadia's military machine was built like a laser gun, simple, reliable, and easy to repair with standard parts. When components failed, they were replaced with identical components that performed identical functions according to identical procedures. The machine never stopped, never slowed, never hesitated. It simply processed human beings into military assets until there were no more human beings to process. The efficiency was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Kadia had become a perfect example of what the Imperium could accomplish when it focused all its resources on a single objective. The objective was not victory. Victory was temporary, achievable, finite. The objective was perpetual warfare, sustained conflict that would continue until every human being in the galaxy had been transformed into either a soldier or a resource for soldiers. Kadia was not fighting to win the war against chaos. Kadia was fighting to prove that war itself was the natural state of human existence. A few things still work, though none are kind. The Departamento Munitorum identified several strategies for surviving extended combat operations on Kadia, tactical approaches that had been tested under battlefield conditions and proven effective for maintaining unit cohesion despite catastrophic casualties. These procedures were classified as emergency combat protocols and distributed to all personnel with command authority above the rank of sergeant. The protocols were not designed to ensure individual survival. Individual survival was considered a fortunate side effect of procedures designed to maximize unit effectiveness and minimize resource waste. The protocols assumed that most personnel would die during implementation, but that their deaths would occur in ways that provided tactical advantage for surviving personnel and valuable intelligence for future operations. Protocol 1 was known as strategic withdrawal, a euphemism for abandoning defensive positions when they became untenable. Strategic withdrawal required specific documentation, threat assessment reports, casualty projections, tactical situation summaries, and authorization from command staff at least 2 levels above the unit requesting withdrawal. The documentation was designed to ensure that withdrawal decisions were based on objective analysis rather than emotional reactions to battlefield stress. The paperwork typically took between 4 and 6 hours to process, during which time most units ceased to exist as functional military organizations. The delay was intentional. It prevented units from withdrawing prematurely while ensuring that withdrawal authorization would only be granted when the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any reasonable hope of successful defense. Strategic withdrawal was considered successful when retreating units managed to deny strategic objectives to enemy forces, inflict casualties exceeding 50% of the withdrawing unit's strength, and preserve enough personnel and equipment to form the nucleus of a reconstituted unit. The success rate for strategic withdrawal operations was approximately 12%. Protocol 2 was called tactical redeployment, which meant retreating to previously prepared defensive positions in good order while maintaining unit integrity. Tactical redeployment required extensive advanced planning, detailed knowledge of terrain features, and coordination with multiple support elements including artillery, logistics, and communications. Tactical redeployment was only authorized when previously prepared defensive positions actually existed and could be reached without crossing terrain controlled by enemy forces. Since Kadia's defensive positions were typically prepared by the units that had previously retreated from them, most tactical redeployments ended with guardsmen discovering that their fallback positions were already occupied by the enemy. The enemy forces occupying prepared positions typically included Chaos cultists, who had been waiting in ambush, Chaos Space Marines who had established forward observation posts, and demon entities that had been summoned through ritual activities conducted in areas with significant warp corruption. The prepared positions often contained booby traps, improvised explosive devices, and ritual circles designed to summon additional demon support. Tactical redeployment was considered successful when retreating units reached their designated positions with at least 25% of their original strength and sufficient equipment to establish defensive perimeters. The success rate for tactical redeployment operations was approximately 18%. Protocol 3 was designated as fighting withdrawal, a procedure that involved retreating while maintaining contact with enemy forces and inflicting maximum casualties during the withdrawal process. Fighting withdrawal required units to maintain discipline and fire control while moving through hostile territory under direct enemy fire. The protocol assumed that retreating forces would have ammunition, functional equipment, and sufficient personnel to conduct an organized withdrawal. These assumptions were rarely accurate. Most units attempting fighting withdrawal discovered that their ammunition had been exhausted during previous engagements. Their equipment had been damaged by enemy fire or environmental hazards, and their personnel strength had been reduced below the minimum levels required for effective tactical coordination. Fighting withdrawal operations typically devolved into chaotic routes within the first 30 minutes of implementation. Individual soldiers abandoned their units and attempted to reach safety through individual initiative rather than coordinated group movement. The survival rate for individual soldiers was higher than the survival rate for organized units. But individual survivors rarely retained enough equipment or information to contribute meaningfully to subsequent military operations. Fighting withdrawal was considered successful when retreating units managed to delay enemy advance by at least 6 hours while inflicting casualties exceeding their own losses. The success rate for fighting withdrawal operations was approximately 8%. Protocol 4 was known as Scorched Earth, which meant destroying everything of potential value to enemy forces before abandoning a position. Scorched Earth required demolition charges, incendiary devices, and sufficient time to properly destroy facilities and equipment. The protocol was designed to deny strategic resources to enemy forces while creating obstacles that would slow their advance. Most units attempting Scorched Earth procedures discovered that they lacked either the resources or the time necessary to implement the protocol effectively. Demolition charges were typically in short supply because they were also used for combat engineering, breaching operations, and improvised explosive devices. Incendiary devices required fuel and ignition systems that were often needed for other military purposes. The time requirement was the most significant obstacle to effective Scorched Earth implementation. Proper destruction of military facilities required careful placement of explosive charges, systematic dismantling of critical equipment, and coordinated timing of demolition sequences. The process typically required between 12 and 18 hours to complete properly. Enemy forces rarely provided 12 to 18 hours of undisturbed time for demolition activities. Most Scorched Earth operations were interrupted by enemy contact within the first 2 hours of implementation, which meant that destruction was incomplete and many facilities remained intact for enemy use. The enemy typically captured intact facilities along with detailed instructions for their destruction, which provided valuable intelligence about Imperial engineering practices, security procedures, and tactical doctrine. In many cases, captured Scorched Earth instructions were more valuable to enemy forces than the facilities themselves. Protocol 5 was called Last Stand, which was not actually a survival strategy but rather a method for dying in a manner that would inflict maximum casualties on enemy forces. Last Stand procedures required units to hold defensive positions until completely overrun, fighting to the last man while denying the enemy access to strategic objectives. The protocol was considered successful when enemy forces sustained casualties exceeding 50% of the defending unit's strength. This calculation did not include enemy casualties that could be repaired, replaced, or resurrected through chaos sorcery, which meant that the actual effectiveness of Last Stand operations was significantly lower than official statistics suggested. Last Stand operations provided excellent training opportunities for enemy forces, who could practice assault tactics against determined defenders without risking their own strategic objectives. Chaos forces particularly appreciated Last Stand defenders because prolonged combat generated the emotional intensity and bloodshed that enhanced their ritual activities and pleased their demon patrons. Most Last Stand operations ended with the complete annihilation of defending forces and the capture of their positions with minimal delay to enemy operational schedules. The psychological impact on enemy morale was negligible because Chaos forces considered the destruction of Imperial troops to be recreational activity rather than military necessity. Individual survival techniques focused on practical skills that could be learned quickly and applied under battlefield conditions. Combat veterans developed several unofficial strategies for increasing their personal survival probability. Methods that were passed down through informal training and practical demonstration rather than through official channels. The survival techniques were not officially sanctioned because they prioritized individual preservation over unit effectiveness, which was contrary to imperial military doctrine. Veterans who taught survival techniques to new personnel were subject to disciplinary action if discovered by commissariat personnel, but the techniques were considered so valuable that the informal training continued despite official prohibition. The first technique was called battlefield navigation, which meant learning to read terrain features, weather patterns, and enemy movement indicators to identify safe routes through contested areas. Battlefield navigation required understanding the difference between concealment and cover, the acoustic signatures of different weapon systems, and the visual indicators that revealed the presence of mines, booby traps, and enemy observation posts. Terrain features that provided concealment included vegetation, debris, smoke, and structures that blocked line of sight but would not stop enemy fire. Terrain features that provided cover included reinforced walls, vehicle hulks, crater lips, and natural rock formations that could absorb or deflect incoming rounds. Experienced soldiers learned to move from cover to cover while avoiding areas that provided only concealment. Weather patterns affected visibility, sound transmission, and equipment performance in ways that could be exploited by knowledgeable personnel. Rain reduced visibility, but also masked movement sounds and equipment noise. Wind affected the accuracy of projectile weapons and the effectiveness of chemical agents. Temperature extremes affected battery life, mechanical function, and human performance. Enemy movement indicators included disturbed vegetation, equipment tracks, abandoned positions, and patrol patterns that could be observed and analyzed to predict future enemy activities. Experienced soldiers learned to recognize the signs of recent enemy presence and avoid areas where contact was likely. The second technique was equipment improvisation, which meant using standard military equipment for purposes other than those specified in technical manuals. Combat engineers taught guardsmen how to construct communication devices from Voxcaster components, how to manufacture improvised weapons from entrenching tools and ammunition components, and how to create shelter from salvaged materials that would provide protection against environmental hazards and enemy fire. Communication devices could be improvised from Voxcaster components when standard equipment was damaged or unavailable. The improvised devices typically had limited range and poor signal quality, but they could maintain contact between isolated personnel and provide emergency communication capability during tactical emergencies. Improvised weapons included explosive devices constructed from ammunition components, projectile weapons made from salvaged materials, and close combat weapons fashioned from entrenching tools, bayonets, and structural components. The improvised weapons were typically less effective than standard equipment, but they could provide combat capability when standard weapons were unavailable. Improvised shelter could be constructed from salvaged materials, including vehicle armor, structural debris, and equipment containers. The improvised shelters provided protection against environmental hazards such as radiation, chemical contamination, and extreme temperatures, but they were not effective against direct enemy fire. The third technique was casualty management, which meant learning to provide medical treatment using battlefield expedients when proper medical supplies were not available. Experienced Medicaid personnel taught basic surgical procedures that could be performed with improvised instruments, pharmaceutical substitutions that could be created from standard ration components, and psychological techniques for maintaining morale among wounded personnel who could not be evacuated to proper medical facilities. Basic surgical procedures included wound cleaning, bleeding control, and infection prevention using improvised instruments and sterilization techniques. The procedures were not as effective as proper medical treatment, but they could prevent deaths from treatable injuries when proper medical care was not available. Pharmaceutical substitutions included pain relief medications made from ration components, antiseptic solutions created from cleaning supplies, and stimulant drugs extracted from standard combat medications. The substitutions were not as effective as proper pharmaceuticals, but they could provide essential medical support when standard supplies were exhausted. Psychological techniques included stress management, trauma counseling, and morale maintenance procedures that could be applied by non-medical personnel. The techniques were designed to prevent psychological breakdown among personnel who had been exposed to extreme stress or traumatic experiences. Step back far enough and the pattern refuses to blink. Kadia was designed to die, built to break, constructed as a monument to the specific mathematics of imperial military doctrine. The planet served its purpose not by winning victories, but by losing them slowly enough to matter, by transforming defeat into delay, and delay into tactical advantage for forces that would never see the battlefield and would never fill out the casualty reports. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Every dead guardsman bought approximately 18 minutes of tactical delay for enemy forces. Every destroyed facility required between 2 and 6 hours of enemy time to repair or replace. Every successful defensive action forced enemy commanders to commit additional resources to overcome Imperial resistance. The delays accumulated into strategic advantages for Imperial forces operating in other theaters. While Kadia absorbed the attention and resources of the 13th Black Crusade, other Imperial forces could conduct offensive operations against less defended Chaos territories. The trade-off was mathematically favorable. The resources invested in Kadia's defense were less than the resources that Chaos forces were forced to commit to its conquest. The 13th Black Crusade succeeded not because it overwhelmed Kadia's defenses, but because it finally exceeded the planet's capacity to process suffering into strategic value. For 10,000 years, the world had converted human lives into military assets with industrial efficiency, transforming fear into discipline and despair into dedication through the careful application of bureaucratic brutality. When the system finally collapsed, it was not because the guardsmen stopped fighting, but because there were no longer enough clerks to file the paperwork documenting their deaths. The administrative apparatus that had sustained Kadia's military machine for 10 millennia finally succumbed to the volume of casualties it was required to process. The planet's final battle reports were never completed because the personnel responsible for completing them had been killed before they could finish their documentation. The last casualty reports were found months later in underground archives, incomplete forms filled out in handwriting that became increasingly erratic as their authors succumbed to wounds, exhaustion, and despair. The planet that broke before the Guard did had one last gift for the Imperium, a complete record of how to die properly, filed in triplicate and stored in archives that would survive the planet's destruction. Future military campaigns would benefit from Kadia's institutional knowledge, its 10 millennia of experience in transforming human beings into ammunition for a war that could never be won and would never end. The archives contain detailed documentation of every aspect of Kadia's military operations, tactical doctrine, administrative procedures, equipment specifications, training programs, casualty processing methods, and psychological conditioning techniques. The documentation was so comprehensive that other Imperial worlds could implement identical systems without requiring additional research or development. The Astra Militarum learned to measure victory not in territory gained or enemies destroyed, but in forms completed, reports filed, and requisitions processed according to regulation procedures that had been tested under the most extreme battlefield conditions imaginable. Kadia's clerks had continued working until the planet cracked open, typing casualty reports while reality collapsed around them, maintaining proper documentation standards even as the Eye of Terror swallowed their world. The bureaucrats who inherited Kadia's archives discovered that the planet's final reports contained more information about effective military administration than the previous 1,000 years of Imperial military history combined. The reports documented not just what worked under battlefield conditions, but what failed, why it failed, and how the failures could be prevented in future operations. Your worst day at the office suddenly looks kind. The bureaucrats who complain about paperwork and deadlines have never had to fill out a death certificate while the person being certified was still shooting at them. They have never had to calculate replacement requisitions for equipment that was destroyed by enemies who should not exist according to any rational understanding of physics. They have never had to maintain proper filing procedures while their office building was being demolished by artillery bombardment from weapons that fired shells the size of cargo containers. They have never had to meet quotas for casualty processing while demon entities stalked the corridors of their administrative complex, hunting for souls to feed to their patron gods. They have never had to explain to superior officers why their productivity declined during periods when the local laws of physics were suspended and mathematics stopped working properly. They have never had to justify resource allocation decisions made under conditions where time moved backward and cause followed effect, according to the whims of entities that existed outside rational space. Kadia's final lesson was that suffering can be systematized, that horror can be administered according to proper procedures, and that death can be processed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that governs any other institutional function. The planet died as it had lived, by regulation, in triplicate, with proper documentation and appropriate authorization from command staff who would never read the reports they had required. The lesson was not lost on the Imperium. Kadia's administrative methods were adopted by military organizations throughout the galaxy, refined and improved through practical application under diverse battlefield conditions. The planet's death became a template for institutional efficiency, a model that demonstrated how human resources could be processed into military assets, regardless of external circumstances. The machine grinds forward because the machine needs what it needs. The machine does not care about individual suffering because individual suffering is not a relevant metric for measuring institutional effectiveness. The machine cares about throughput, efficiency, resource utilization, and output quality, according to specifications that have been refined through 10,000 years of practical experience. The machine is perfect because it has been perfected through the deaths of countless billions of human beings who served as test subjects, raw materials, and quality control samples. Every aspect of its operation has been optimized through trial and error, with errors measured in planetary populations and trials conducted across entire star systems. Efficiency is measured in corpses per administrative hour. Quality is measured in the military utility of processed personnel. Success is measured in the continued operation of the machine itself, regardless of the cost in human lives or the suffering of individual components. Service is mandatory because the machine requires constant input of raw materials to maintain operational effectiveness. The raw materials happen to be human beings, but this is considered a design feature rather than a limitation. Human beings are abundant, easily replaceable, and capable of performing complex tasks with minimal training. Obedience is eternal because the machine cannot tolerate components that operate outside design specifications. Components that malfunction are replaced immediately to prevent systemic failure. Components that resist processing are subjected to corrective maintenance until they conform to operational requirements. The machine endures because it has been designed to endure. It processes human suffering into military utility with the same efficiency that other machines process raw materials into manufactured goods. It transforms individual tragedy into institutional strength through procedures that have been tested under conditions that would destroy lesser organizations. Kadia fell, but the machine survived. The machine learned. The machine adapted. The machine incorporated Kadia's lessons into its operational procedures and continued grinding forward, consuming human beings and producing military assets according to specifications that grow more refined with each passing century. The machine grinds forward because the machine needs what it needs.